After a break of 2 weeks, my community has returned. Like I have done in the past, I begin with a grateful heart, a heart full of gratitude. I wish to thank Sir David Seal and the folks of the People's Market for their support of the production of this series so that you may have an episode each week. Secondly, on behalf of my family, I wish to thank all of you for your prayerful support and expressions of condolences during the last 2 weeks when my dear sister Margolden Laverne Graves Nee McCaskey transitioned from this life as we know it. My family is thankful. This week's presentation of My Community begins now as the spotlight falls on Nelson Street and surrounding areas. In placing his community in perspective, Wendle Seeley begins by giving us a sense of the time period when he was born.
Well, firstly, I was born in the midst of the riots. 1937, August. And my father tells me that he was stationed at Holtown as a police officer when I was born, and he left Holtown and rode his bicycle to Oxley Street, where he was born, without even seeking permission. He just told the sergeant his wife had a baby and he was going. But it's in the midst of the riots. Oxley Street is that street that runs westward from the old hospital wall, outside St. Ambrose Church, right down to what is known as Beckwith Street. Oxley Street and Chancery Lane, which is the street which runs south from the same point, around the same hospital wall, down to Nelson Street, have interesting histories in that the area is known as Rabbit's Land, and the area I'm speaking about starts from Bay Street, just off Bay Street, and runs east, all the way to the hospital wall, north to River Road, almost. And it was owned by a family called the Rabbits. And there's a great history, which you can read in Alien's books and whatnot, about the development, the family disputes, and the resolutions. And Oxley Street was cut for further development, and so was Chancery Lane. And this first street was named Oxley after Oxley, who was the head of Chancery. And the other street, which runs along the wall, right around the curve, and down to Nelson Street as Chancery Lane. I didn't spend a long time down there. I came to Britain's Cross Road at 18 months to tell me. But because I'm a St. Ambrose person, I spent my entire life. I still spend it in the area, because that's where I go to church, and that's where my life revolves. There's quite a lot of contradiction, as it were, in the history of that area. Nelson Street has always had this reputation, and people don't seem to be able to understand that persons of character lived in Nelson Street, almost always on top of either their businesses or businesses carried on by someone else. The thing about the Nelson Street and the contradiction is that we are told in history that lots of the gentry of the country moved nearer to Bridgetown in order to facilitate their work in their offices and wherever they were in Bridgetown. And it's interesting that you can find a host of names of persons of repute who lived in the area, while at the same time there is this volume of history of the other aspects of the area. This contradiction, which I think still exists to some extent, because what has happened now is that the area has become the domain, as it were, of persons who first came as traders. And that was the day trade. Then it increased or improved, I'm not sure which, into a 2-day or 3-day stay, until eventually they all became permanent members of society. Quite a few of whom now were not born in Barbados, but who have adopted Barbados over the years. It has changed the scene in the sense that growing up, we knew everybody's family. We are now beginning to learn the offspring of these original trading persons. And what has happened is that you see it from the names, and then you realize that the children have been in Barbados, all of them, they were born here. So they are not from wherever their parents may have come from. They are, in fact, full-blooded Barbadians. I still find myself traveling Nelson Street almost every Sunday, because I always have somebody to drop somewhere after service. The area has changed in that it was always bounded on River Road by the well-to-do. And those houses have now, those homes have now all been converted into businesses. So that if you started at King William Street and you came right around River Road, almost to see to the Ready Fusion building, you would have had a whole host of families of the well-to-do. All those buildings now are commercial enterprises. That has made a change. The change on Bay Street. I remember as a Sunday school superintendent doing visits along Bay Street. We did annual recruitments every year, and we had to visit all of the parents of all the children of the Sunday school. And there were homes on Bay Street, almost always on top of the businesses at the bottom. That has all disappeared. So that I look forward to the changes being proposed for the area to see how it develops. But I don't know if I live long enough to see it come to fruition.
We will keep hope alive, Mr. Seeley. Now, one of the prominent features on the landscape of the area is the St. Ambrose Anglican Church. Mr. Seeley has enjoyed a long association with this church.
The development of the church in the area, therefore, is almost strange. But we are told that the spot on which the St. Ambrose Church was in fact the venue of a cockfighting activity. which was illegal. And whether this prompted the Rabbit brothers to donate it, or whether it was the largest spot available is mute. But the fact is that the spot on which the church was erected was in fact a swampy area where cockfighting took place. As a matter of fact, we have suffered from the excessive moisture that exists. Since in those days there was no damp proofing, and you use sea sand. So the combination of the dampness and the salt has caused us quite a bit in maintenance over the 160-something years of the existence of the church. As a matter of fact, when we had wooden floors in the church, we didn't have as much of a problem as we do when we thought we had graduated into concrete floors. But that's history, and that's life for development. But ever since we put the concrete floors down, we've had quite some difficulty with salt emerging from the walls. And while I remember as a boy, there was only one single area in the church where this manifested itself. It has now spread almost the entire area of the church, and we have a constant financial cost in trying to keep it looking presentable. But that's the price of progress, in a way. But so St. Ambrose was built. The thing about St. Ambrose is that it was not always a full church. In 1858, when it was consecrated as the Chapel of Ease of St. Paul's Church, because the driving force behind St. Ambrose was a man called the Reverend Joseph Mears, who was an assistant priest at St. Paul's. And St. Paul's had begun to see the increase in congregation, and it was a challenge for their church. And it was Reverend Mears, who thought of the idea of having a smaller church somewhere else. And I don't know if he played any part in the choice of this spot, but he did do a lot to encourage the Rabbits to donate the land on which the church stands. So in 1857, work was begun, and with the help of the generosity of quite a few of the gentry, the church was built within a year. And on the 1st of January, 1858, it was dedicated by the then bishop. So New Year's Day every year is our anniversary. St. Ambrose developed as the area developed, and St. Ambrose had a history of music, good music. And a lot of this, a lot of this resulted from the fact that our organist was a lady called Ione Curtin, who is the mother-in-law of the late Doris Provençal. Yeah, Doris was married to Mrs. Curtin's son, who had emigrated to Canada during the war, and who resided in Canada after the war. He was a member of the Canadian Army, and he remained in Canada and married Doris, and eventually they came home And Doris, interestingly enough, was also a musician. And St. Ambrose had a musical history that is unbelievable and rivaled any of the larger churches. As a matter of fact, I remember as a boy singing in the choir, where St. Ambrose had as many persons outside of the church, at the windows, looking in and listening, as they were inside, and inside was almost always packed. One of the things, of course, that is that in those days, persons who didn't go to church were quite happy to go near the church. And they didn't seem to want to dare to step into the church for whatever reasons, but they would surely make sure that they were within earshot. And St. Ambrose had this rich history. It also had a very good choir. Firstly, of males, sorry. And at some stage after that, girls were brought into the soprano line. But we had families of boys singing in St. Ambrose Choir. The Riveras were 4. The Cumberbatches were 4. The Oxleys were 6. The Trotmans, there were only 2 Seeleys, but what that meant was that we always had a full choir. But our Good Friday presentations were always looked forward to by music lovers and were always well attended. But Mrs. Curtin was one of those persons who loved music. And as a matter of fact, she eventually lost her sight, but never stopped playing. All she wanted you to do for her, to tell her how many verses of the hymn there were. And when it came to the psalm, to let her know when we were at the last verse, so we could sing the glory. But she played for years after that. You had to lead her onto the stool. Then once she got on the stool, she was at home. And that's something that we've never forgotten.
How could you, Mr. Seeley, the inspiring story of Mrs. Curtin and her legacy, live on in Barbados today? Now, there was a time when the men, after singing and hearing the word proclaimed in the St. Ambrose Church, made their way to a special location in the community where they enjoyed that special drink thought to have spirits.
It was not unusual for the men of St. Ambrose to gravitate to this shop after service. To chat, of course, but chat always ended up with a drink. What I always remember this is that you knew when you became a man, because in those days you were at the church with your parents, with your father, and you didn't get up and go home. You were at home with your father because he brought you from home. So when the men are going to Mr. Calendar's place to have a chat, and of course a drink, you accompanied them. But you were not allowed beyond the wicket door. And you were given a Coke. But in front of those, it was a Martineau. Again, another liver of the area, the corner of Beckwith and Bay Street. And You got your marshmallow and you sat down and waited. If there were 2 or 3 of you boys, you talked, your own talk. But then, the day you were allowed to get a little snippet, as it were, you knew you had become a man, because you weren't allowed even in the conversation. They were in their section, in the men's section, as it were. You were not allowed in there because you were a boy. So you knew when you had graduated. You knew when you were a man because you had graduated to the point where you could now be offered a drink.
And that drink was alcohol. From one type of shop to another, we cannot speak of this area and its commercial activities without celebrating the late Gwen Workman and those special items which she prepared for her patrons.
Gwen Workman is known to me because as a boy, I knew Miss Workman in Brittensill, since I lived in Brittensill for all of my formative years. So that when she came to Nelson Street, it was not a greeting, it was just a relocation. Gwen was opposite our cousin's place. And we by then had begun to work. No, we hadn't been, not when she first came. We were still at school. And there was the Sunday evening activity. We left Sunday school, we went to the Pierhead, we went to the park, and you walked your best girl into the park and back out, or down the Pierhead and looked out. But service was 7 o'clock. So you had to come back to St. Ambrose by 7:15. Because Miss Curtin was very strict. And you didn't walk into church at 5 to the hour. If you had hoped to robe, you'd better be there by 7:15. Or you didn't robe. And she sat where she could see you. She never let anything block her. So by 5:30, 6 o'clock, we would head from the Pierhead or the park back to the general area. And Mrs. Oxley, who had 5, 6 boys, would always have tea and this bread sliced for us. And nobody ever told me that I had to go to Miss Oxley before I got to church. And nobody told me that you had to provide a cup of tea for me, cocoa, one from the north. But it happened. I never realized that they were lead pipes until long after, when we started going to Gwen and buying lead pipes, that I realized that it was lead pipes that Miss Oxley had been buying and slicing for these Petora boys who were coming to our house on their way to church this evening service. Having gone to Sunday school and gone, as my mother would say, gallivanting. So that was one of the things about lead pipes that has stuck with me, that I'd been eating them without realizing that they were lead pipes. But Gwen was as famous for pork cutters as she was for lead pipes. You could not find a sweeter or more succulent pork cutter than at Gwen. And I remember years after, as a member of the staff of the General Post Office, after having worked until about 1:30 or 2 in the morning, still going straight to Gwen Workman's place to get something to eat before going home because we had to be back at work for 7 o'clock the same morning. So Gwen did transform that aspect of food service. And as you know, she became a household word name all over the country, even though she operated, because people came from wherever they were to Nelson Street just to get lead pipes and pork cutters.
Yes, and they were sold from Gwen Workman's shop in Nelson Street. Now, what about entertainment?
What I think about the era also is that the club Zanzibar is as well known in some parts of the world, I suspect, as in Barbados. But what's interesting about the Zanzibar, in my estimation, is this, that as a youngster, I remember the Zanzibar facing the bus stand. It was not always on Nelson Street. And when we say the bus stand, we need to remember a couple of things about that area. The main bus terminus was near where the cenotaph is, west of the old Treasury building. I say old because it's no longer occupied by the Treasury. But it was on a raised plane, and I don't know. I just can't remember when that was knocked down. But the buses reversed and parked against that 2-foot rise. So you could walk across from the public buildings, which housed the entire government service in those days. And you came across and you stepped or jumped down and boarded the bus. Of course, the buses were all wooden. This is long before we had our first metal frame. And the Merrymen's story about taking a hand up my tray is as real as it can be, because you stepped up into the boardroom shingle bus. There was a platform, and this is the first step, and then you step into the bus. So that when you sat in the bus at the corner, and the lady with the tray was passing, she couldn't see your hand, because they were adept at this. They knew where everything was on the tray. They never took it off their heads. If you called for nuts, they did this. If you called for sweets, they did this. And as a consequence, the fellas, every so often, would pinch a pack of nuts. Only 3 cents in those days, a penny, but they would pinch them nevertheless. So taking out my tray is not a creation of the Merrymen, it's a fact. The fellas would every now and again try to pinch the things, because the lady's here and the tray is above her head and in line with your hand, and if you reach across, unless you felt the movement or the loss of weight, well, the pack of nuts wouldn't make any difference to the weight. But that was that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Seeley. This has been My Community. I'm sure Wood McCaskey, be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors. Until next week, goodbye.